Welcome to this WiseOwl Report Builder tutorial. In this video we'll look at how to create a basic matrix. We'll start by adding a matrix to a report and then explain how to assign fields to create both row and column groups in the matrix. We'll move on and look at how to assign a data field and how to choose which aggregate function is applied to it. We'll show you how you can change the grouping fields after you've assigned them for the first time, and also how to affect the sorting for both the row and the column groups in the matrix. We'll look quickly at how you can add a summary column and summary row, and finally at the end of the video explain how to create a header for the matrix which spans all of the columns regardless of how many there are. So let's get started. As a basic example of the type of thing we'll create in this video, here's a report with a couple of simple matrix report items showing details from a database of movies. Hopefully the formatting of yours will end up a lot nicer looking than mine, but of course that's not really the point of the video. What we want to focus on is how you can control both the row groups and the column groups of the matrix. So for example, on the left hand side we've grouped the rows by the country, and on the right hand side we've grouped the rows by the genre. Each example has its columns grouped by the certificate awarded to each film, and then the data points are made up of the average runtime in minutes for all the films in that particular group. We've also added a summary row and a summary column to each matrix, and added a header which spans all of the columns of the matrix at the top, and we'll learn how to do all those things throughout the course of this video. In order to get started, you will need a copy of the WiseOwl Movies database, and if you don't already have it installed, you can use this video to help you get it set up, and you'll find a link in that video's description, which you can use to download any files you'll need. Assuming you've already done that, I'm going to head over to Report Builder, where I've got a blank report waiting for me, and I'm going to right-click on my Data Sources folder in the Report Data window and choose to add a data source. I'll call this Movies, and then choose to use an embedded connection pointing to a Microsoft SQL server. Then I'll click the Build button to help construct the connection string. For the server name, I'm going to type in a shortcut to my local host, so /, and then the name of the instance of SQL Server I'm going to use. In this case is called SQL 2017. Once I've typed that in, I can use the drop-down list towards the bottom of the dialog box to select my movies database. Click OK a couple of times, and there's my data source created. Now that we have the data source, we can use that to create a data set. I'll right-click on Movies and choose Add Dataset. I'll call this one Films, and then click the Query Designer button to help me construct the query. I want to select columns from a variety of tables here so that I can demonstrate various things throughout the video. I'll start in the film table with the one column I'm going to use to aggregate my information. So I'm going to find the average runtime in minutes eventually of all my films. So I'm going to pick just the runtime minutes field. I then also want some columns I can use to categorize and group my data. So I'm going to go to the certificate table next. There are two columns in there, the ID number of each certificate and then the actual certificate name. I'm going to include both columns from this table for this video. So I can do that either by ticking the boxes individually or just ticking the box next to the table name. I want to do the same thing for the country table, so I want to include both the country ID and the country. And then finally for the genre table as well, I'll tick the box next to the genre table to include both columns from there. Having done that, I can click OK and OK one more time, and there's my dataset created. Now we can add our first basic matrix, but let's start by tidying up. I'm going to get rid of my title placeholder text box, and then I'll right-click into the page footer and choose to remove that. Then I can right-click into the report body and choose to insert a matrix. If I just click into a cell in the matrix, you may notice a few differences to a regular table. Rather than having a details icon on the left-hand side, which indicates the details row, the three horizontal bars. In fact, let me just insert a table so you can see what I'm talking about. In a table, you get this three horizontal bar symbol, indicating that that row will be repeated for every individual line item, every row in the underlying data set. In a matrix, however, you don't get that symbol. You get the symbol for a group instead. You get the symbol, this sort of bracket-looking symbol. And you get one of those not just for the rows, but also for the columns. So basically a matrix comes along with its groups already created for you. All you have to do is choose which field will generate the individual rows and the individual columns in that group. Let me just get rid of the table, and I'm going to start by assigning the country field to the rows group. I want to group my first matrix so that all the country names appear down the left-hand side. So to do that, I can either drag the country field from the dataset into the rows group, or I can select country using the field selector button here. Just before I run this, I'm going to make sure that I don't run into the font rendering bug. You may have encountered this where when you run a report, it doesn't display a lot of text in the table or the matrix. So I'm going to highlight all the cells and then switch from the default font to any other, and then just back to the default font. If I then run the report, I will end up with a separate row for each individual country in the dataset. Creating column groups is equally easy. Let's head back to the design view and then position the mouse cursor over the columns cell, and then from the field selector I'm going to choose the certificate field. Again, if I now simply run the report, you'll see that it's generated a separate column for each different certificate in that dataset. So creating the groups is incredibly simple. In fact, the groups already exist. All you need to do is choose which field generates the individual columns and the individual rows. Now let's show some data in the matrix. I'd like to show the average runtime in minutes for films in each group. So back to the design view, and in the data cell I can use the field selector once again to select the runtime minutes field. Runtime minutes is an integer field, it's a numeric field, and whenever you add a numeric field to a matrix, it will automatically apply the sum function to that. You can probably see that in that cell. You can modify this in a variety of ways, but probably the simplest is to click on the word sum so that it highlights the entire expression in blue, and then I can right click on the selected text and choose summarize by, and then simply switch that to the aggregate function that I actually want to use. So in this case I'm going to use the average function, or AVG. Having done that, it won't look particularly pretty when I run this, but if I do run it, you can see clearly that it's generating a data point for each combination of country and certificate, where there are films in that combination of country and certificate. At this point, a little bit of basic formatting will go a long way to making this a little more readable. I don't want to spend too much time on this, but just to tidy up the display of this matrix, I'm going to head back to the design view, and then I'm going to select that single detail cell first, and then I'm going to launch the formatting dialog box by clicking the dialog box launcher button at the bottom right hand corner of the number group. I simply want to change the number format so that it shows with 2 decimal places. So I can select the number option, and then the decimal places is automatically set to 2, so at that point all I need to do is click OK. I'll just also change the column width of the country column so that everything appears on a single line. And then I'm going to change the background colour of the header cells. So I'll select that row and then use the fill colour button to format the background colour, maybe make the font bold as well. And then for the country names, I'm going to format those in a different background colour. So I'll choose pale grey and then make those bold as well. So nothing too complicated here, but if I run the report, it should make the world of difference in terms of the appearance. Maybe I'll just do one last thing and center the values and the headers. So I'll head back to the design view, select the certificate and average runtime, so those 2 cells, and then click the center text button, and then run the report again, and that looks a lot neater. When you assign a field to the row or column group of a matrix, it doesn't just determine what value gets displayed in the cell when you run the report. It also determines which field is used to perform the grouping in the first place. Now that might not necessarily be the most efficient way to group your data. For example, for our row groups, we've based that on the country name. So we can see the text description of the country name, but that's also how the data is grouped. We also have access to the country ID, which is a simple number, an integer. And if we can apply grouping using the country ID, you may find better performance when you run your reports. So let's have a look at how we can do that. If I switch back to the design view, I can modify the group properties using the row groups panel at the bottom of the screen. I can right click on the country group and choose to view its group properties. So you can see here already that I've got on the general page of the dialog box a groupon expression using the value of the country field. If I click on the drop down arrow, I can select any other field from my dataset. I'll go with country ID, click OK. This, of course, doesn't affect what value gets displayed in the cell. I'm still displaying the country name, but the grouping is now performed on the ID number of the country, so the end results are the same, but you might find better performance. One other thing which happens automatically when you first assign a field to a matrix is that it uses that field to assign a sort order. You can clearly see that our country names are listed alphabetically, even though we didn't explicitly assign a sort either to the matrix or to the underlying dataset. For the country names, that's actually a good thing. I do want to see them listed alphabetically. But for the certificates, this is less helpful. I'd prefer to see my certificates listed in order of age that the certificates represent, so starting with U for universal, then PG for parental guidance, etc. That sort order is actually the way that the values are stored in the underlying certificate table. So the universal or U certificate has an ID number of 1, PG is 2, etc. So I'd like to change the sort order of the certificate group so that it's sorted based on the certificate ID. To do that, I can go back to the design view, and then I can right-click on my certificate column group and choose to view the group properties. While I'm here, I'm going to change the group on expression so that it uses the ID rather than the certificate, as that may improve performance. And then I can head over to the sorting page and see that I've already got a sort order created for me automatically simply by assigning that field to the matrix in the first place. All I'm going to do now is change the field to certificate ID, click OK, and then run the report again, and we'll see now the certificates are sorted in the order I want. It's important to understand that the automatic grouping and sorting only apply for the first time you assign a field to either the row or the column cell in the matrix. And that's important if you decided you wanted to change the structure of your matrix. It isn't necessarily as simple as you might expect. Let's create a copy of this existing matrix and then change the grouping so that it works to show us a separate row for each genre in the genre table. If I head back to the design view, I can copy my matrix fairly easily by first of all selecting it. I'll drag a rectangle around part of it to select it. I can then press Ctrl and C on the keyboard to copy it, followed by Ctrl and V to paste it. I'll drag this copy of the matrix over towards the right hand side. I'll leave a bit of a gap for some extra things we'll do later on. And with this matrix selected, it's tempting now just to select the new field I want to display in that cell. So I'll change the country cell to say genre instead. I could also change the title of that column to say genre just so that it matches. Having done that, if I run the report, you'll see that it doesn't actually change the way the matrix is structured at all. All we've actually done here is selected which field's value is displayed in the row for each country group. The country group still applies and the country sorting still applies. So you can see here we've got duplicate genre names. Martial arts appears several times, as does thriller and fantasy, etc. So, as well as changing the value displayed in the cell, we also need to change the field which is used to perform the grouping. Let's head back to the design view, and I'm going to select my second matrix so that I can see the existing row group now called Country 2. I'm going to right click on that and choose Group Properties. I'm going to change the name of the group so that it makes a little more sense. I'm going to call it Genre, and then I'm going to change the Group On expression to refer to the genre ID. I also want to make sure that my fields or that my genres are sorted alphabetically by the genre name rather than by the country. So if I head back to the sorting page, I can change the sort by expression from country to genre. Having done all that, if I click OK and run the report again, we'll now see that the second matrix correctly groups by the field I'm also displaying. Adding a summary row and a summary column to a matrix is nice and easy, and while we could take the manual approach whereby we would insert an extra column and an extra row and then recreate the aggregate function for the runtime minutes field again, that's a much simpler way to do it. Back in the design view, if you right click on the data cell of the matrix, the one which contains your aggregate function, whether that's a sum or an average, etc., you can then choose the Add Total option from right down the bottom of the list and then choose either row or column. You've got to do them one by one. I'll add a total row to begin with, and that will appear at the bottom of the matrix, and it adds the same aggregate function. It's a little tricky to see because I've centered the text. If I just left align that text in the cell, you can see it's just created the exact same expression on the total row. Total is a bit of a poor choice of label for the average. It's not going to total up all of the averages. It's going to take the average runtime for each certificate, regardless of what country they belong to. So it's not an average of averages. It's not a total average. It's just the average without the country grouping applied. If I just switch that back to a center alignment and just run the report so you can see the results. There we go, we've got our total row, which I should really relabel as average for certificate or something along those lines. Adding the equivalent column so that I can find the overall average for each country is equally straightforward. Back in the design view, I can right click on that initial data cell again, and then choose add total column. And again, I get the same expression. I get the average of runtime minutes. So whatever expression is in your data cell already is the one that's replicated in your summary row or summary column. I do want to make sure that I've got finally the overall average for runtimes for the entire table. Sadly, that one doesn't get added for me automatically, but I can choose the runtime minutes field, which annoyingly provides me with a sum of runtime minutes. As if I just left align that again, you can see it gives me a sum rather than an average this time. But I can click on the word sum and then right click, summarize by, I'll try average, the one that I actually wanted to use rather than max, beg your pardon. There we go. One other slightly irritating thing, as you'll see in a moment when I actually run this, is that final bottom right hand corner cell doesn't retrieve the number formatting, so the number of decimal places is far more than it needs to be. I'll just tidy this up a little bit, head back to the design view. I will select the bottom right hand corner cell, launch the number formatting dialog box and choose to assign a number format with 2 decimal places. I will then just apply some basic formatting to this as well. So I'm going to change the background color of each of our total cells, and then I'm going to change the label applied. I'm going to change this from total to, I'll call it column average or column AVG, and then here I'll call this row AVG. Final little bit of formatting for that bottom right hand corner cell. I'll make this a slightly darker color with a lighter font color, and then a quick look at the results, and that doesn't look too terrible. The final thing I'd like to do is create a header cell for the matrix, which automatically spans across all of the column headers generated by the field in the column group of the matrix. There's no automatic way to do this, so we'll have to do it manually. Let's switch back to the design view and start by selecting a cell in the matrix so that we can right click on the grey box to the left hand side of the current matrix headers. I want to insert a new row above where I currently am, and I have to choose whether that goes inside or outside the group. Now, it isn't immediately obvious what the effects of this will be, that the two options actually look the same. If I click in outside group above first, you can see I get 3 separate cells which I can select. If I just right click and then delete that row, if I choose to insert a row inside the group above, it looks exactly the same. There's no distinguishable difference there. Having inserted a row inside the group, let's have a quick look at what happens if I type in a dummy title. If I run the report at this point, I end up with the word title sitting above each individual column generated by the column group field. Not quite what I wanted. Now, I might say, oh, well, why don't you just merge those cells together? Well, I can't merge them together because I can't even select them back in design view. There is just one single cell there that represents each cell generated by the certificate field in the column group section. So I'm going to right click and delete that row. If I right click and insert a new row outside the group above, although it looks the same, when I type in the word title this time and then run the report, now we see a single cell which spans all of the cells in the column group section. Now it still appears as though there are 3 separate cells in this header of the matrix, because there are. There's one above the country column, there's one above the row average column, and then there's this merged one sitting across the column group section. Ideally, I'd like to select all those 3 cells and merge them together, but sadly I can't do that in a matrix. If I head back to the design view, if I select all 3 cells on that header row, I don't get the option to merge them. I can't select merge on the home tab of the ribbon, and I can't right click and choose merge cells in the menu either. A simplistic way to simulate merging the cells is just to get rid of the borders around the cells. So I can do that by highlighting all 3 of them, and then use the border tool on the home tab of the ribbon to choose none. Having done that, if I run the report now, we'll see that those 3 cells now appear to be 1. Now I'd like to change my dummy title into the actual title for the matrix, which I'd like to call something like Average Runtime by Country and Certificate. And this is going to expose another little quirk of header cells in a matrix. If I get rid of the word title there and start typing in my actual title, so Average Runtime by Country and Certificate. When I click away from that, obviously I can't see the entire title in design view because the column isn't wide enough. But when I run the report, I know that that single merged cell is going to be wide enough to display my entire title. However, even though that's the case and I can clearly see the title written out on one single line, in design view, because it spills across multiple lines, I get the multi-row height header cell, which looks a bit daft. A fairly simple way to solve that problem is to tell that cell that it cannot increase its height based on the value contained in it. So back in the design view, I can do this in a couple of ways. One fairly simple way is to right click on the cell which contains the header and then choose text box properties and uncheck the box which says allow height to increase. Once I've done that, I can click OK, run the report again, and now my header cell for the table is 1 single row height. So there's our basic matrix created. At this stage you might like to play around with some more basic formatting options, so you might like to pick a different colour for the main matrix header. You may also like to take away the borders around the certificate column headers and also around the column averages as well, just to make those look a little cleaner. Other than that, that's creating a basic matrix. Hope you found that one useful. Thanks for watching, see you next time.